Hi, everyone. This is Global Podcast, your window to the world. Breaking news, big ideas, your global hangout for what's happening now, and bold conversations. Wherever you are, we're bringing it to you. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we, try to make sense of the world one headline at a time. And today is Tuesday, March 25th, 2025. So we are looking back just a little bit at yesterday and today to see what's happening. We've got a lot to cover.
We do. It's a busy news cycle.
It is. So let's jump right in. What are we looking at today?
Well, we've got that really intense situation in Israel and Gaza still going on, obviously, after that hospital airstrike. And we've also got some trade war stuff brewing up with Canada, plus some really interesting developments with Greenland and Elon Musk and Starlink.
Oh, yeah. And how can we forget the bullet train derailment in Japan?
Right. A lot of things happening seemingly unconnected, but maybe we can find some threads that tie it all together.
Exactly. Our mission is always right. So let's start with that breaking news out of Gaza. The UN Security Council had an emergency meeting yesterday because of that Israeli airstrike on the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis.
Yeah, that was a big one. 35 people killed, including medical staff and a senior Hamas official, Ismail Barhoum.
And of course, Hamas retaliated right away with rocket attacks into southern Israel. They say 12 people were hurt in Sturdo.
Yeah, it's a really, really bad escalation. And the Israeli military is saying they had evidence that Hamas was rebuilding tunnels under civilian areas.
I guess that's their justification for the strike, but 35 people, that's got to be one of the deadliest single incidents this year.
It is. And, it's just adding to an already horrific situation in Gaza. The UN estimates over 50,000 deaths since October 2023 and over 1 million displaced people facing famine. It's a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions.
So this emergency meeting at the UN was called by France and Jordan, right? And they're focusing on that humanitarian crisis.
Yes, but here's the thing. The U.S. and Russia could veto any real action. That's always the big question mark at the UN, right?
Right. Will they or won't they? I mean, this is getting a lot of attention worldwide. The hashtag Gaza genocide was trending all day yesterday on X.
Yeah, and that kind of global outrage puts pressure on everyone involved. So maybe we'll see a UN resolution for a ceasefire, or maybe some countries will act on their own. Like maybe Turkey or Egypt will step up with more aid.
It's definitely a possibility, but there's also a chance things could get even worse, if Iran-backed groups get involved.
Exactly. And then there's the oil situation. Prices are already high at $92 a barrel. But if the fighting starts affecting shipping routes, we could easily see it go over $100.
Okay, well, speaking of things that could affect prices, we have to talk about this brewing trade war with Canada. What's the latest?
Well, it looks like Canada is about to announce retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, probably 10% on things like steel, aluminum, and agricultural products.
Wow, 10%. When are they planning on doing that?
Probably April 1st, which is really no coincidence because Trump is threatening a 25% tariff on Canadian goods starting April 2nd.
So it's like a, tit for tat.
Exactly. And the markets are already freaking out. Dow futures dropped 500 points pre-market, and the Canadian dollar is getting weaker.
Yeah, this all goes back to Trump's tough talk on trade, right? But I feel like VP J.D. Vance really pouring gasoline on the fire with that comment about Canada being disloyal.
Yeah, that didn't help. And then you've got Prime Minister Carney up for re-election on April 28th, so he can't look weak on this.
No, he has to show he's standing up for Canada, and their economy depends heavily on trade with the U.S., right?
Oh, absolutely. About $400 billion in exports every year. So a lot is at stake for them.
So it's interesting to see how this is playing out with Trump's base versus, everyone else.
Yeah, his base seems to love the hardline approach. But I've seen a lot of American farmers on X who are really worried about losing their Canadian markets.
Right, because that's a huge chunk of their business. So what could happen if all this actually goes through?
Well, it could spiral out of control, right? Like both sides keep raising tariffs and then everyone in North America ends up paying more for everything. Cars could go up 5 to 10% easily.
Wow, that's significant.
Yeah, and our whole supply chain could get messed up too. And then there's the question of whether Mexico will jump in and do the same thing as Canada.
Right, because they're all tied together with NAFTA. So how is Trump likely to react to all this?
Well, he might double down, stick to his guns, or maybe Wall Street will freak out enough that he decides to negotiate. Who knows with him?
Okay, well, let's move on to another interesting situation. Greenland has been in the news lately. Why is that?
Well, a U.S. delegation was supposed to visit Nuuk, but they had to cancel the trip because of those violent protests.
Oh, yeah, those protests got pretty bad, right?
Yeah, 12 people got injured and Denmark had to send in more police.
And the protests are all about Trump's interest in buying Greenland, right?
Exactly. He wants it for the rare earth minerals and for setting up Arctic bases. But Greenlanders are not having it. Over 5,000 of them were out protesting.
And today, their parliament is meeting to vote on a resolution rejecting any U.S. takeover.
Yep, it's a big deal. And it's putting Denmark in a tough spot because they haven't really taken a strong stance one way or the other.
Yeah, and that's causing some tension within NATO, especially after VP Vance basically called Denmark a bad ally.
Oops. Yeah, not very diplomatic. But this whole thing has gotten a lot of attention from environmentalists, too. They're all over X, linking it to the fight against climate change.
Right, because Greenland is kind of ground zero for that.
Yeah.
So what happens next?
Well, things might calm down a bit now that the U.S. delegation canceled their visit, but Trump might try to pressure Denmark in other ways, economically.
And if Greenland keeps saying no to the U.S., that means we might not get access to those important minerals.
Right, and that would be a problem for our tech and defense industries.
Okay, well, let's move on to Japan, where they're dealing with the aftermath of that horrifying bullet train derailment.
Yeah, that was just awful. Japan Railways has confirmed now that it was caused by a 4.8 magnitude earthquake.
Wow, an earthquake. So the Shinkansen isn't invincible after all.
Apparently not. And the death toll has risen to 18 now, with 92 injured.
That's so sad. And this is a major disruption too, right?
Oh, yeah. The Tokata line is still closed, which means 200,000 commuters can't get to work or school today.
It's amazing to think that something like this could happen to the Shinkansen. I mean, it's famous for being so safe.
I know, right? This is the first fatal derailment in decades, and it's really shaken people's confidence because that whole network is worth $9 billion, and it's crucial to their economy.
So now people are wondering if Japan's infrastructure is as strong as we thought.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk on X about whether they cut back on maintenance after COVID, to save money.
That's a scary thought. So what kind of impact is this going to have?
Well, the economic losses could be huge, maybe $2 billion, and the stock price of JR Central has already taken a hit.
Yeah, and this might force Japan to speed up infrastructure upgrades, to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Right. And even though we know the earthquake was the cause, there were some people on X saying it was sabotage. But the authorities say there's no evidence of that.
Okay, well, shifting gears again, let's talk about Russia and Ukraine because those ceasefire talks have fallen apart.
Yeah, U.S. officials in Riyadh are saying the talks are dead after that Russian missile strike on Sumy yesterday.
10 people were killed in that attack, right?
That's right. And then Ukraine refused to give up any territory in the Black Sea, so the whole thing just blew up.
And the Saudis who were mediating, they've pulled out too.
Yep.
Which doesn't bode well.
This war has been dragging on for so long. It's day 1,125 and still no end in sight.
And, Trump tried to get involved too, but nothing seems to be working.
The core issue is still the same, though, right? Russia wants Ukrainian territory, and Zelensky wants them completely gone.
Yep, it's a stalemate. And there's this theory going around on X that Trump's pro-Russia stance might have actually encouraged Putin to be more aggressive.
That's an interesting theory. So what are the likely consequences of these talks failing? Well, grain prices have already jumped 2% to $220 a ton, which is going to hurt a lot of people.
Yeah. It's a global food security issue, and we could see Ukraine retaliate with more drone strikes.
Right, and Russia might start targeting their energy grid again, which would make this coming winter brutal for Ukrainians.
And what about Trump? How does this affect him?
Well, it makes him look like a less effective negotiator, unless he changes his tune and starts putting more pressure on Russia, maybe with sanctions.
Okay, well, let's move on to something a bit more techie. Elon Musk is trying to save that Starlink deal with Italy.
Yeah, it's a $1.6 billion deal to provide secure military communications. But it's on hold right now.
So what's the problem? Why is it on hold?
Well, some people in Italy are worried about Musk's connections to Trump, and they're not crazy about some of the stuff he posts on X.
I can see why they'd be hesitant to trust him with their military secrets.
Right. And the Italian Defense Minister Crosetto even said there's been a political shift, which is a pretty clear sign they're having second thoughts.
Plus, the EU has its own project, IRIS-2, which is supposed to be an alternative to Starlink, but it's behind schedule.
Yep. So Italy needs this deal, but they're not sure about Musk, and there's a big protest planned in Rome against the deal.
It sounds like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
They are, and the public is divided too.
Yeah.
You see people on X praising Starlink's technology, but then others are worried about giving Musk too much power.
So can this deal still be salvaged?
Maybe if Musk can convince the Italians that he's not just Trump's puppet. If he distances himself a bit from Trump's policies, it might help.
But those protests are a big obstacle too.
They are, and if the deal falls apart, Italy will probably have to go with a more expensive option like Eutelsat.
And that would mean delays in their military upgrades.
Exactly. And it'll also fuel the push for Europe to be more independent when it comes to technology.
Now, for something I honestly didn't see coming, the U.S. might reopen its embassy in Kabul.
Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise. There seems to be some progress in talks with the Taliban about reopening at least a small part of the embassy.
Wow, really? So what would that look like?
They're talking about an interests section, which is smaller than a full embassy, and they're aiming for June 2025.
But there's a catch, right?
Of course, the Taliban has to cooperate in fighting ISIS-K.
Which makes sense because that was a big part of Trump's justification for pulling out of Afghanistan in the first place, right?
Exactly. He wanted to end those forever wars, and now he's saying that reopening the embassy is part of his plan to stabilize Afghanistan and fight terrorism.
But hasn't he always said he wouldn't negotiate with terrorists?
Well, he has, but things change, right? And for the Taliban, this could be a way to gain some legitimacy on the world stage, especially for the Haqqani faction.
But a lot of people are criticizing this move, especially because of the Taliban's human rights record.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of anger on X about the way they're treating women.
So what could this actually lead to if the embassy does reopen?
Well, it could help with the fight against ISIS-K, but it could also end up legitimizing the Taliban, which wouldn't go over well with a lot of people.
Right. And what about other countries in the region? How are they going to react?
Well, China and Iran probably won't be thrilled about this, and they might try to counter it by strengthening their own ties with the Taliban.
And could this lead to more aid for Afghanistan?
It's possible.
Yeah.
I mean, their poverty rate is a staggering 90%, so they desperately need help.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, and it's worth remembering that the U.S. Embassy in Kabul closed in August 2021 during that chaotic withdrawal.
Right, and since then, the U.S. has been handling Afghan affairs from Doha.
So this would be a big change, and some people are even saying that Zalmay Khalilzad might be involved, as the ambassador or special envoy.
Interesting. He was a key figure in the 2020 Doha agreement, the one that led to the U.S. troop withdrawal.
Right, and the Taliban seems happy about this. They see it as a step towards normal relations.
Yeah, but the big question is, what conditions will Trump set for this to happen? Will he demand more than just vague promises about fighting terrorism?
Yeah, and there's going to be a lot of pushback at home, too.
Oh, absolutely. But the bottom line is that Trump sees Afghanistan as strategically important, because of its mineral resources and its location.
Okay, well, let's wrap up with one last story. India is scrambling to figure out how to respond to Trump's latest trade threats.
Yeah, this Liberation Day tariff thing is a big deal. He's targeting Canada, Mexico, China, and the EU with reciprocal tariffs.
He's really going all out on this one.
He is, and he's saying it's all about bringing back jobs to America and fighting unfair trade practices.
But it's already causing chaos, right? Canada's hitting back with their own tariffs. Mexico's probably going to do the same thing. China's tariffs have doubled, and the EU is bracing for impact.
Exactly. It's a global trade war brewing, and India's next on the list.
Even though he hasn't announced specific tariffs against them yet?
Not yet. But he's called India the tariff king, and he's complained about their high tariffs for years.
So they know they're in his crosshairs, and Prime Minister Modi has called an emergency meeting to figure out what to do.
Yeah, they've got to come up with a plan fast because that April 2nd deadline is looming.
And their trade relationship with the U.S. is huge, right?
Huge. Last year, they exported $74 billion worth of goods to the U.S. and imported $42 billion.
So they have a big trade surplus.
Which is exactly what Trump hates.
So what are their options here?
Well, they could hit back with their own tariffs, tit for tat.
But wouldn't that just escalate things?
It could. Or they could try to make a deal with the U.S., offer some concessions.
But wouldn't that make them look weak?
Maybe. Or they could try to find new markets, reduce their reliance on the U.S.
But that takes time.
Exactly. They're in a tough spot.
Uh-huh.
And it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do.
Especially since they're supposed to be negotiating a trade deal with the U.S. anyway.
Right. They met back in February and agreed to work towards a deal by fall 2025. But Trump also warned them about those reciprocal tariffs.
So it's a delicate balancing act for them.
It is. And the outcome could have a huge impact on India's economy and on the global trade landscape.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from Gaza to Greenland to Japan to Ukraine. It's been a whirlwind.
It has, and it shows just how interconnected everything is.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. Out of all the events we discussed today, which one do you think will have the biggest long-term impact on the world?
That's a tough one.
It is. There's a lot to think about. But that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the news.
See you then.